Rockland County is steeped in history. It was home to one of the earliest European population clusters in America, coming to Haverstraw in 1609. It is one of the centers of the American Revolution, boasting the first victorious battle against the British at the fort in Stony Point in 1779. It has a rich history of Native American relations, some of which were very difficult at times, yet harmonious at other times. The Industrial Revolution had a hand in Rockland's development too, with factories and population hubs surrounding those factories. Rockland's proximity to New York City brought artists of all kinds to live in the quiet, idyllic, nurturing woods and meadows that could be found all around the county. Farming, too, was important in the area. At one point, Rockland had literally hundreds of farms operating at the same time, feeding not only neighbors, but people from far away. There was also a part of American history that could be found in Rockland, one that existed long past the point it should have. That was racial discrimination. In some sections of Rockland County, young people of color were not permitted to attend school with white children. Separate but equal laws were in place long before the 1896 Plessy v. Ferguson ruling in the Supreme Court, which legally upheld the practice. It legally allowed one school for white students and one for colored. The term colored was used at that time to categorize African Americans, Native Americans, and persons of mixed race. These laws were part of what was derisively called Jim Crow laws, named after an offensive theatrical character created in the 1820s to symbolize the separate but equal practice. In many places in the U.S. and in Rockland County, this ugly practice died due to new legislation, changes in the social fabric, or the simple attention to right and wrong. But in communities both in the North and the South, and in one place in particular, segregation in education hung on long after the state law permitting it changed, and whose community leaders purposefully maintained the practice. They even devised ways to circumvent the law so that children would be kept apart from one another, based solely on their color. That place was Hillburn, just 19 miles from New York City, in the New York State town of Ramapo.
You have to take a look at geographically how that allowed that to occur. Hillburn, through no fault of its own, in 1930 was divided in half by what was known as Route 2, which would later eventually become Route 17. And that, in a sense, bisected the village. And because of the fact that the people of color lived on the other side, they were very easy to say, okay, well, here's the line, because they're on that side, we have the other folks on this side, and that's the way it's going to be.
For just about as long as anyone could remember, the whites and the people of color in Hillburn went to different grade schools. It was a time of growth in Rockland County, and despite its still relative isolation, it took its role in the growth of the region and the country seriously. There were bricks to be made in Haverstraw, farms to feed people in Clarkstown, factories to make products in Hillburn, and its larger surrounding villages like Suffern or nearby Mahwah in New Jersey. Hillburn, a 2.2 square mile enclave, had a unique demographic makeup. Its population of around 1,000 included whites, African Americans, and members of several different Native American tribes, including Ramapo Lenape.
To take a look at the complexion of Hillburn, it really mirrored what was happening in other communities at other times. There was a period during the 1920s when there was a resurgence of the KKK on the national level, and there were elements of that in Suffern and Hillburn as well. The unfortunate thing is that they were able to influence certain members of the community to utilize the Presbyterian Church in Hillburn to meet there. And there were times where crosses had been burned.
In 1912, what would become Ramapo Central School District built a new school, the main school in Hillburn. It was a school for white children only. The colored children in the community had attended the Brooke School since the 1880s. And that would not change. The main school was well appointed, had indoor plumbing, athletic facilities, a library, and other amenities that made going to school easier for the white children. For the colored children, there was no indoor plumbing for restrooms, no recreation facilities or places to read. Kids needing the bathroom had to go outside in all seasons, in any kind of weather. Classrooms were hopelessly overcrowded with multiple grades housed per classroom.
Growing up in Brooke School, I knew that it wasn't much fun to go to school in. No indoor bathrooms. And this certainly wasn't true with my home. We had all the conveniences, and to go to school and have to use the outdoor bathrooms was probably the worst thing that happened. There was a barber shop, and in a sign in a barber shop, it's no colored allowed. And that was point blank. That was right out in front of you. You could see that. There were many other things where we just knew.
It was very much segregated. We had crosses burned on our properties. We were called names. We had no rights. It was just, we didn't realize that that was wrong because that's what life was at that time. But when our parents decided it was time to change, this is when the school problem became, started to go.
In the community, you actually knew your place as a person of color. You knew where you weren't supposed to go or how you were supposed to speak. Whites were in control.
What's now the Fountain Park was a great skating area, and we did not skate there. The Native Americans and African Americans did not skate there until finally some people, including my father, decided that shouldn't be anymore.
The first people in this country to be called Negroes, or my ancestors, or Lenape people, were Native American. They were looking for a terminology to denigrate the Indians because they were enslaving us. And of course, it's become synonymous with black people now. But if you go back and say Negro, you would never think Indians.
We were referred to as the colored people of the village. African Americans and Native Americans were both termed colored. And I knew that there were Native Americans and African Americans among my friends and fellow students. And this is what we were classified. The main school was for white children, and Brooke School was for colored children.
This practice of segregating schools in Hillburn was an extension of the prevalent attitudes among whites in the community, that so-called colored people were inferior to whites and not entitled to the same rights and privileges as whites. By 1930, many colored people in Hillburn, including a postal worker from Washington, D.C., who had moved up to the village but worked in New York City, began to object to the way things were being handled. He was Thomas Alexander, and it was his contention that separate but equal may have been separate, but it was anything but equal.
He worked in New York City, so there couldn't be reprisals against him. He got on the bus every morning, went to New York City, he worked in the post office, and therefore he was free to say things and do things that others were not able to do because of their livelihood.
There was an NAACP chapter. Thomas Alexander was the president. He contacted the national NAACP. He spoke with some of the lawyers on staff. They advised him on what kind of information he should be looking for, how to examine school data. And that was the beginning of what became the Hillburn protest.
He was an outsider and a troublemaker. They didn't want him saying that. My father got involved in NAACP because of conferring with his co-workers that somebody has probably advised him of using the NAACP to make some progress, because he could see that nothing was getting done without them.
For some reason, there was a difference between two kinds of schools in New York State at the time. The kind of school district that the Hillburn was did not allow segregation, and the other kind did allow segregation. So the white school board changed the kind of district that Hillburn was, and that made it possible for them to maintain their segregated schools until 1943.
There was a huge disparity between the main school, and I mean even it's, you know, the Hillburn main school, that in and of itself is a bit offensive. When you say one is main, what does that make the other then? And you're talking about a small community that had two schools serving one population, what should have been one population.
School board president J. Edgar Davidson asserted that the harmonious relationship that existed in Hillburn between white and colored children was actually aided by the segregated school system. He even went on to maintain that having Negro teachers in Negro schools would be better to teach the children because they would understand the so-called peculiarities of the race.
Well, the Davidsons were a family that held a lot of power in that community. They were a part of the power structure of the Ramapo Iron Works, which later became the Ramapo Ajax Company. A lot of the homes they were owned, and so a lot of the Negro workers or the colored workers lived in those homes. He was also the president of the school board.
His father, R.J. Davidson, was one of the founders of that community in terms of the iron works and was an executive there. And J. Edgar Davidson was well educated and came back to his hometown and in a sense commanded respect.
The state would change their rules and Mr. Davidson would find some other way to circumvent it, to get around it.
Your entire livelihood could be affected by these individuals because they hold the key to everything. They hold the key to your children's education, to your home, to the work that you do in order to maintain your life.
And I think that they felt that their view of Christian goodwill was to take care of those that were less fortunate. The unfortunate thing about that is, I think that some of it was done in a rather paternalistic way.
The ladies that Mrs. Davidson would invite to her house for tea from called Brooke Community is where the colored people lived. No matter where you lived, you were from Brooke Community. She had a collection of those people that she would invite to her house for tea. That's how they would find out what was going on in the neighborhood, our side of the village.
Here we were talking about separate but equal, and it wasn't equal at all. So when Tom Alexander saw the minutes of a meeting of the Hillburn Board of Education, he noticed that they were setting aside some money to build a playground, to expand the playground here at Main School. And at the time, separate but equal meant that we should also be building a new playground for the Brooke School, for the students of color. And that didn't happen, but that was the first in the movement to make things better than they had been.
Thomas Alexander's request to change the separate but equal education policy in Hillburn was ultimately denied. Segregation was a concept and practice that began to be challenged on the basis of the deleterious impact it had on academic achievement.
At the time of the Emancipation Proclamation, certainly when we started recruiting for World War I and subsequently for World War II, when we began to recognize the impact of segregation on academic achievement, there still is this pretty consistent difference between the academic performance of low status people and high status people. The distance between the high achieving people and the average or low achieving people is what we've referred to as the achievement gap.
In 1938, there was a law passed that didn't allow segregated schools, but the village of Hillburn decided not to do anything about their schools.
The local school board and community leaders purposefully maintained the practice. The district was called to task on their practice in November of 1941. But just a few weeks later, Pearl Harbor was bombed. We were thrown into World War II, and what was happening in Hillburn schools lost its priority. It wasn't until a year and a half later that another group of parents took up the fight to end Hillburn's disgrace. Local families became determined to close Brooke School and have their children attend Main School. They organized and determined they would seek help from the NAACP, just as Thomas Alexander had done more than a decade earlier.
Well, we'd heard enough about it to know that this would be a nice place to be. I have an older brother and sister who were now in Suffern High School, but they knew about this school, and they had experienced Brooke School, so they told me what to expect pretty much.
And I do remember when we went to the school, we were called names. Well, we knew that they were prejudiced, that they only looked at us by the color of our skin, and some of us are rather light, so if it wasn't Hillburn, they may not know what we were.
This school had everything that Brooke School didn't. It was a large concrete building. It had a library. It had a playground outside that we used. It had jungle gym and things of that nature. Brooke School had none of those things, so I knew that this was a good place to be.
But some of them were very nasty to us as we went over to the school, called names and threw rocks, and we didn't get as far as the water hoses like they did down south and those things. But it wasn't a nice place to be at that time.
All right, this is the site of Brooke School, and the brook actually was changed a little bit when the road was widened up here, but this originates in where there was a reservoir up on top of the mountain, and this is where the name Brooke School and Brooke Church came from. There were 4 rooms in the school after the addition was put on, and there were 2 grades in each classroom, so that 1st and 2nd grade would be in one classroom, 3rd and 4th, 5th and 6th, 7th and 8th. That wasn't unusual. I remember when I was in 2nd grade, I had been in the same room in 1st grade. We just moved across to the other side of the room when we were in 2nd grade. And that, again, that wasn't unusual, but it did create crowded conditions because at the time there were more students in this school than there were in the main school. That's another reason that Tom Alexander and others wanted to make sure that, that things were equalized somewhat.
The NAACP sent a young attorney to Hillburn to see if segregation was, in fact, still the policy in Hillburn, despite the 1938 law ending segregation in schools. Regional NAACP attorney Jacob Wexler had urged the young man to come to Hillburn and get involved. The up-and-coming attorney, who had been working on civil rights cases around the country, was the head of its Legal Defense and Education Fund, Thurgood Marshall.
He was a very young lawyer at the time, but still a very brilliant man. Never hurts to have intelligent people working for your cause and making sure that the right people know about your cause. Following some of the same steps that Thomas Alexander had followed, but I think what was the benefit at that time was the fact that the 1938 law happened that said that you cannot have legal segregation in the state any longer.
The school board, still headed by J. Edgar Davidson, as it was in the 1931 case, was ordered by the New York State Education Department to end the practice of segregation. Instead, as a response, they quickly enacted a redistricting of the community, which they claimed ended segregation and complied with the ruling. However, that redistricting effectively drew a circle around where most of the colored families lived and assigned children in those families to Brooke School. So nothing really changed, and Hillburn schools were still segregated.
They came up with a plan, a zoning plan, that when Thurgood Marshall came to Hillburn, he took a look at that zoning plan and said, that's surely segregation.
I think it affected his view of segregated schools outside the South in a very substantial way. He was alerted to the ways school, not only the assignment of black students to one school and white students to another school, but later in the development of Hillburn, he came to clearly see how northern school boards gerrymandered district lines to contain segregated housing areas. And then within that segregated housing district assigned pupils to a school. So it impressed him, and it alerted him, more than impressed him, alerted him to the techniques of school boards elsewhere in the North.
You can see a change in attitudes amongst Black people. We're at war. You're asking us to support the country and fight for democracy someplace else, abroad, a place that we don't know much about. But here at home, we're under oppression. Our children don't have running water in the school. They have secondhand books, and they don't have the same kind of facilities that white children have. And why is that? When we're asked to go and put our families on the line, our husbands, our men, on the front lines.
Thurgood Marshall devised a strategy to integrate the main school by attempting to enroll one child from Brooke School. He believed if one child could be admitted, then the rest would be admitted.
Okay, this was the dividing line between the white section of the Hillburn and people of color where they lived. And on this other side over here, you had mostly white families. And on this side, you had families of color living here. One of these houses was a house where Alan Morgan lived. And when the test case was made, they decided to take Alan and his parents to try to register them at the main school, and they were not accepted there.
When 8-year-old Alan Morgan was denied enrollment to the main school, brave Native American and African American families, aided by Thurgood Marshall, pushed for integration once and for all. Marshall and the Brooke School parents met and decided that they would no longer permit their children to go to Brooke School.
Yeah, as we got turned away, we walked back across the village to Brooke School and didn't go into Brooke School. We sat out, there was a kind of a abutment out there. We sat down on that and thought about what was going to happen next.
Mr. Marshall, who represented the NAACP and local NAACP president, Mrs. Marion Van Dunk, informed school officials that if all students weren't permitted to attend the main school, the students would not return to the Brooke School. That meant that 55 Brooke School children who were denied admission were on strike. Davidson continued to show concern that the fine colored people of Hillburn were being led astray by outsiders and would have never gone to such action on their own. Thomas Alexander's earlier effort failed, in part because so many of the parents were beholden to the local factories they worked for and were frightened of losing their jobs. But that fear was gone in 1943, since the factories needed to have enough workers to produce what the country required for its war effort. The parents could keep their children out of school and not fear retribution from Mr. Davidson, who, in addition to being school board president, was the COO of the American Brake Shoe Company, one of the major employers in the community. His was the major voice in the community, and in the past, crossing Mr. Davidson could have serious results.
To actually step out of line could be dangerous in a number of ways. The Ku Klux Klan was active in Rockland County as well as at that time. So just living under that threat of having your entire life changed by one action is very frightening.
Well, a lot of the men were either in service or they were working in the iron industry. And there was always the threat of reprisals. If they did too much in a way of looking for equality, they would hear about it from their bosses.
The parents showed their resoluteness by bringing in a number of teachers and setting up school in a nearby church. The parents wanted to be sure their children would not fall behind in their studies, as this strike would be a long one if necessary.
And we knew at some point we were going to be going to school again. We were going to be going to Brooke Chapel, Brooke Church, where it was kind of a school that was set up for us because we weren't attending this school, they weren't allowed to attend this school, and we also were not going to attend Brooke School. We were going to stay away from that as long as we could.
Thurgood was a master tactician, strategist, and a superb lawyer. In many ways, Thurgood was an insider in terms of the rule of law. He believed in the legal system. He didn't believe in throwing rocks at it. He didn't believe in ridiculing it. He believed in preparing yourself and making it work for you.
The strikers received support from communities near and far, including from a large rally with more than 600 people at the Golden Gate Ballroom in Harlem. They raised enough to be able to purchase school books and equipment and provided for the teachers at the temporary school.
Access to capital is really a kind of fancy term to talk about being rich or poor. Rich people have access to money. Poor people don't have access to it. Capital can be thought of as a resource. In democratic countries, you have to combine it with power. So when we talk about access to capital, we're also talking about access to power. The people who have access to money, or even if they don't have money, have access to political power, do very well. The people who don't have access to it do very poorly.
Community leaders came up with the idea of the strike, not the NAACP. Thurgood Marshall said many times that he was not part of the decision to begin or continue the strike, but most would agree that the Brooke School parents were inspired by Marshall and were proud to have his help.
When Thurgood went to court, utmost respect for the bench, no matter how badly he was being treated. Yes, Your Honor. No, Your Honor. That's there, sitting where he's supposed to sit, doing what he's supposed to do, and Thurgood knew his craft.
The school board dug in as well. They informed the parents that if their children did not return to school, they would be declared truants and would have to face the consequences in court. Again, almost all of the parents refused to budge.
I think that the issue was the quality of education available to black people.
The mood was different than it had been. Most people in the community were law-abiding citizens, and if you were supposed to do this is exactly what you did. Now here was something that sort of filtered down to us kids, that we were supposed to be in school today, but we're not in school. And I think there was a feeling of, this is something that ought to happen now.
Before 1943, wasn't enough drive, backbone in the colored people. And they would not have stood together, I don't believe. It took Marion, who became the president, the chairman of the chapter, to speak to them, and she was tough with the men too. To make you feel bad, you know, let you know that you didn't have any backbone. Alan Morgan Jr., his mother, Eleanor, was another one like Marion. She was a tough, stern lady, and she didn't think anything of approaching the Davidsons or anybody else.
Many residents in Hillburn of color, they didn't think it was fair that their kids had to go to a school that had no indoor plumbing, and there was a school right across the village within a quarter of a mile that you know, that had a new gymnasium, library, etc. So she was one of those students that was held truant, and I have to give my maternal grandparents credit for actually taking a stand at that time and saying what's right is right.
The board did declare the children truants, and their parents had to answer in family court. William Mealy represented the district. Thurgood Marshall represented the families. Judge John McKenna agreed they were truants and handed down fines of $10 to 22 of the parents. He then agreed to suspend those fines if the children would just go back to Brooke School.
And they kept me out until we had to go to court. And then at that point, they gave in a little bit because they had been threatened, as all the parents had been threatened, about a fine of $10 unless we returned to school.
Most of the parents agreed they would hold out until they could close Brooke School forever. Marshall wrote to State Education Commissioner George Stoddard and petitioned him to open Main School to everyone. Mr. Stoddard held a meeting in his office in Albany with school board members, Mr. Marshall, and others to discuss the case. After hearing both sides, Stoddard agreed to send 2 state monitors, Joseph Lipsky and Don Essex, to Hillburn to report on the conditions in the schools and confirm whether segregation was still the policy. The 2 monitors spent 2 days in Hillburn and returned to Albany to give their reports to Stoddard. After hearing what the monitors had to say about the quality of education and the physical plants, the Commissioner of Education struck down the 2-school concept and said all children in the district should go to the main school, regardless of where their homes were located. Stoddard said the Brooke School was not worth repairing and said it was uneconomical to provide heat and other services at Brooke School when Main School was only half full and providing those services anyway. The commissioner further added that a board will not set up any line of demarcation for the purpose of racial segregation. It was a great victory for equality in New York.
There was joy, tremendous joy among the color community in Hillburn because we've gotten admitted, we won the case. Our kids are going to go to school in Main School. Yeah, when we were admitted to the Main School, the white parents pulled their children out.
You know, change isn't easy for a lot of people. The white community in Hillburn did not want change. They didn't want their children in school with black children.
This was due to the prodding of Davidson, Hillburn Mayor John Creelman, and self-proclaimed spokesperson for the white people in the community, Malcolm Stead, who had earlier said he wished the KKK would still be in Hillburn. They enrolled instead at Sacred Heart School in Suffern, the Suffern Boys School, Hillburn Presbyterian Church, or other private schools. Their parents would simply not have their children educated alongside colored children.
There was a private school. When the kids left, they either went to Sacred Heart School, a Catholic school in Suffern, or they went to a private school, which was really begun by the white Presbyterian minister. And that was difficult for many of us to understand. How could this minister, in his religious views, how could he start a school for white children? The main purpose being that have them go to school together and not go to Main School with the rest of us. You know, I remember asking my parents, why? Why did they do that? And I guess my parents had to tell me they didn't want their children to go to school with you. For a while I struggled with it, and I said, what's wrong with me that they don't want to come to school with me? Later on, after I thought it through, I changed my question to what's wrong with them that they don't want to go to school with me.
Most families had very large families at that time, and these were working class people for the most part. And so having the ability to continue to pay for your children to go to school just was not realistic for that community. And so they eventually had no choice but to begin to come back.
In one of his cases, he said, "For until our children begin to learn together, there's little hope that our people will ever learn to live together." It was a decision not just for African Americans, it was a decision for our country. It made our country better.
Rockland County has an intriguing history, by the way, but I think it's forgotten. I think when you talk about race and civil rights, they are very hard topics to talk about. People find it very, very difficult to have those kind of conversations. So it is what they call a bad part of Rockland County history that people just want to forget.
Achievement gap between privileged and non-privileged, between rich and poor people, has to do with the quality of the society in which we live, of which schools are a part.
The NAACP and the LDF had not yet decided, as a matter of strategy, when they were going to try to go into and desegregate the elementary schools. Because of all of those, a lot of raw racism across the country. Little black boys and little white girls in schools, all of that. And it came up in the Supreme Court arguments in the Brown cases.
10 years after Hillburn, Thurgood Marshall argued Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, one of our nation's most important civil rights cases before the Supreme Court. What took place in Hillburn played an important role in the successful arguing of that case.
We had no doubt at all that this was going to be a decision of the United States Supreme Court that would fundamentally change America. The preparations for the Brown decision, there were 5 cases challenging legally segregated schools that were combined and ultimately were presented to the United States Supreme Court in single arguments and became known as the decision of Brown versus Topeka.
We are dealing with issues that we have not really dealt with as a nation. I mean, the issues have been there, but we have not focused in on them collectively as a people. Because, you know, we are the United States. And these issues that we're talking about cannot be addressed by a segment of society. It takes all of us. Now, there's a lot of goodwill in this country. That's a lot. And we have come a long way. We really have. Because there are people in this nation who understand that we are a nation of immigrants, and that our differences are our strength. We revel in learning about each other, you know, and hanging out together and learning our different stories and our backgrounds. I mean, it's a wonderful thing.
Our children need to understand, and not just one version of it, but the actual version of it. And I tell people that Native American history is American history. Black history is American history. And the true stories need to be told.
Technology-based world will create conditions that would help people like me get over those mechanical reactions born of earlier experiences, because the technology will enable not only so much more, but so much more understanding. I suspect if I had known how frightened that woman was that these niggers were in the park, I would have been less pained by her chasing me out of it.
I was in the Honor Society, and every year, you know, at the time, I don't know if they still do it, the football team would have a banquet. The Honor Society would have a dinner and so on. And there was dancing. And I was the only African American in the Honor Society at that point. And I remember a girl asked me to dance. And I said, I can't dance. I don't know how to dance. And I knew how to dance. But the reason I was saying that was there in the restaurant, there was out there was a bar. And I could see some white men sitting at the bar. And I'm thinking to myself, my parents had always communicated it to me, you know, don't do anything that's going to upset somebody else racially. And so I just lied and said I couldn't dance.
Thurgood Marshall came back to Rockland 2 more times, one to celebrate the local NAACP and the other to argue against segregation in busing, which called for one high school bus to pick up white children and the other to pick up the colored children.
Yeah, I went to see the play Thurgood with Lawrence Fishburne. And I'm not usually a person who brags about what I've done. But when we came, my wife and I and another couple, when we came out of the theater that night, I said, I could have written that. And the reason that I could have written it is because once I began to know Thurgood Marshall, after I got past the fact of his name being Thurgood, I wondered how anybody named Thurgood could do much of anything. But once I got by that, he became a hero of mine. And I've read everything, and I mentioned to you earlier that the inscription on the monument is something I wrote, which I'm very proud of. It is a chilling thing when I think about him, and I'm so happy that the memorial was put there for him, and I'm so happy to be a part of spreading the word about what he did for all of us here in the village of Hillburn.
What was his message? What was Thurgood Marshall's message? Do something. Be involved. Act. Make sure you know what you're doing. Get the facts and then act. Don't be a bystander. I think that was his message.
He was Dad. You know, I have very fond memories of growing up. He did a very good job of leaving his job at the office for the most part. It wasn't until I got older when I could, you know, really read, you know, that things were on his mind. I had no idea the kind of pressure that he was under, the stress that he was dealing with. I had no idea the magnitude of his responsibilities. I knew something was up when I'm sitting on President Johnson's lap in the Oval Office. You know, then it dawned on me, you know, I think my dad's kind of special in this country.
Hillburn was so important to the story of civil rights in America that the main school was named as a historic site in 2016. And the community, Black and white and Native American, came together to honor those who fought to attend the main school and keep it open to all, regardless of color. Assemblymember Ellen Jaffe was able to garner support from both the Senate and Assembly in New York to get the building listed in the New York Register of Historic Places and in the National Register of Historic Places. This recognition was celebrated on May 15, 2016.
In Hillburn, as in many communities across America, the color of your skin, where you came from, where you lived, determined where you went to school. That was until the courageous women and men of Hillburn's Native American and African American communities said no to segregation. So as we celebrate today, we must not let this momentous occasion lull us into believing that our work is done. And as a member of New York State Assembly and a former teacher, I have joined my colleagues in making this our mission to assure that all children have equal access to the quality of education that they deserve.
Too many of us are silent. We know what's right, we know what's wrong, and we figure we're not in a position of power, of authority, this too shall pass. But we have got to find our voices. When we say united, we mean united. And the only reason we have traveled this far in these 400 years is because we've traveled it together. And we can continue. I mean, we are a tremendous nation. I mean, we're the envy of the world, you know, and we can continue to be that. These social issues are some of the most difficult, intractable ones we have, but they can be solved. We have got to stop putting roadblocks in our own way.
Discrimination doesn't really change. The players change, but the acts themselves don't change. And so looking back at what they did then, looking back what Thurgood Marshall did and how they did it, it's significant because basically it hasn't tremendously changed.
Hillburn became part of the effort to desegregate schools throughout the North and West, that the methods that the Hillburn school officials attempted to use here were adopted and adapted by school systems across the country. And the precedent in Hillburn of the State Department of Education that said to local school officials, you cannot draw school lines based on the color of housing. You cannot gerrymander school attendance areas based on residential segregation. And that established a different way of looking at the issue of segregated schools throughout the country. It was a very important decision, very important issue, Hillburn.
I think Hillburn was the cradle of the civil rights movement in Rockland County. That's where the whole civil rights thing hit a critical mass, when Hillburn parents decided they weren't going to take it anymore.
This was done in a peaceful way. This was done in a thoughtful way. This was done based on case facts, not emotion, not appealing to people's, sense of self-righteousness. It was about, this is the right thing to do because of the following reasons. And they were all very, very valid reasons.
The two schools in Hillburn remind us of the need for ongoing dialogue and constant diligence in monitoring what is happening in our schools. We cannot afford to take even a step backwards. The path to the future in Rockland, as well as the country, is taken one step at a time, with each step bold and assured. Not just for ourselves today, but also for all those who weren't able to take that step in the past.
He said, the battle for racial and economic justice is not yet won. Indeed, it has barely begun. The legal system can force open doors and sometimes even knock down walls, but it cannot build bridges. That job belongs to me, to you, to all of us. The country can't do it. Afro and white, rich and poor, educated and illiterate, our fates are bound together. We can run from each other, but we cannot escape each other. We will only attain freedom if we learn to appreciate our differences and muster the courage to discover what is fundamentally the same. Our nation's diversity offers so much richness of opportunity. Take a chance, won't you? Knock down the fences that divide, tear apart the walls that imprison, reach out. Freedom lies just on the other side. There shall be liberty for all.
Two schools in the same town, two schools, children abound. One school has most of the books, two schools so different with a slight look. One school has heat and running water, one school for the poor man's daughter, one school gleaming in the sun, one school works harder for lessons done. You can make excuses by the book if you must, but if Jesus were here, he'd walk away and shake his head. You can make excuses by the book if you must, but if Jesus were here, he'd walk away and shake his head in disgust. Some say the laws are on the books. Take the easy way, don't give it another look. But when you lay your children to sleep tonight, know they understand what is wrong and right. Southern stories alive in the north should be common sense, should need a court. But common sense and fear walk hand in hand. Hourglass never stops at sand. You can make excuses by the book if you must, but if Jesus were here, he'd shake his head and walk